When I saw her face on the screen, smiling beneath a veil and holding his hand like she had been rehearsing for years, I felt the blood rush out of me so fast it left my ears ringing. It wasn't the kind of shock that makes you gasp or swear out loud, but the hollow, cold realization that the world had been mocking you in silence, and you had been too blind to notice. Because there she was, the woman he had promised me was just a friend. The woman whose name had been threaded through our marriage like background noise, always on his lips with the kind of casual familiarity that only comes from repetition, the kind I had grown to hate but never been able to banish. The photograph was posted by a mutual friend who didn't think twice before sharing it to their feed. My ex-wife stood in front of an altar, radiant in her designer gown, arm linked with him. The same man she swore was nothing but a harmless coworker, a buddy she vented to, someone I had misunderstood. And now, barely 3 months after our divorce papers had been signed, they were smiling for the cameras like they had stumbled into destiny, like the years of my life poured into her had just been rehearsal for the part she truly wanted to play. I can still remember the excuses like they happened yesterday. The late nights at work when she would come home exhausted, too tired to talk, her phone buzzing until she flipped it face down on the counter. The trips out of town for conferences where she sent me pictures from hotel lobbies and restaurants, always careful to stay just vague enough that I couldn't ask too many questions. And every time I let my suspicion slip out in the form of a hesitant question, she would bristle with the practiced indignation of someone who had already prepared her lines. Are you serious right now? He's married. He has his own family. Do you think so little of me that you can't believe I'd have a male friend without it being about sex? God, you're paranoid. She said it so often that the word paranoid began to feel branded into me. I wanted to believe her. I needed to. Because the alternative was tearing apart everything we had built, the shared mortgage, the holidays with our families, the web of mutual friends who would all take sides if things fell apart. So, I swallowed it down. Every time she walked into the kitchen smiling at a text, I told myself it was nothing. Every time she mentioned how funny he was, how he really understood the stresses of her job, I convinced myself it was just work talk. And every time I caught her too quickly locking her phone, I told myself I was imagining things because love is supposed to mean trust, isn't it? Except trust felt less like love and more like self-delusion by the end. I can admit that now, because looking at that photo of them together, it wasn't just betrayal I felt, it was humiliation. I had been the fool sitting in the dark while the theater of my marriage played out for everyone else to see. She didn't even have the decency to wait. 3 months. 90 days between me signing my name at the bottom of the divorce agreement and her smiling for the camera with the man she claimed was a harmless confidant. The comments under the photo cut almost as deep as the image itself. Friends congratulated them, relatives posted heart emojis, and strangers chimed in about how beautiful it was when two people find their soulmate. Soulmate. That word made my stomach turn because it wasn't just about them finding each other. It was about rewriting history, painting our marriage as some half-step, a mistake that needed correcting, erasing me entirely from the narrative except as the bitter ex who couldn't keep up. That's when I realized they didn't just cheat me out of my wife, they were trying to cheat me out of my story. I sat there with my phone in my hand, the screen hot against my skin, scrolling back and forth through the album like maybe one of the pictures would show the lie in their faces, some crack in the performance. But every smile was polished, every pose carefully arranged, and all it did was confirm what I already knew. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't a whirlwind romance that happened after our marriage collapsed. This had been going on behind my back the entire time. The only thing new was that they finally felt free to show it. And it wasn't just the wedding that burned me. It was remembering all the small details I had ignored. The way his name lit her face when she said it. The inside jokes that didn't make sense to me. The time she insisted I shouldn't come to certain work events because it would be boring for me, only to find out later he had been there. The subtle but constant way she made me feel like I was in the way of her friendship. Seeing her now, dressed as his bride, I realized those weren't coincidences. They were rehearsals. You can probably imagine what it feels like to carry all of that in silence. The shame of being dismissed whenever I tried to speak up, the loneliness of sharing a house with someone who was already halfway out the door, the gnawing suspicion that I wasn't just losing my wife, but being played for a fool. That weight didn't vanish when she left. It stayed, pressing on me like a bruise that never healed. But when I saw that photo, when I saw her face next to his, something in me shifted. The humiliation hardened into something else, something sharper. That was the exact moment I stopped blaming myself for being paranoid. I hadn't been paranoid. I had been right all along. They had stolen from me my time, my trust, my dignity, and now they were parading it like some love story worth celebrating. But I wasn't going to let that be the ending. They thought they had written me out, but I knew something they didn't. I was still holding all the pieces of their lie, and I could put them together in a way that would make sure everyone saw them for who they really were. And that's where this story really begins. Not with me losing my wife, but with me realizing I was about to take everything back. Not her, not the marriage, but the power they thought they had over me. The moment that broke me didn't come with fireworks. It wasn't a screaming match or a dramatic discovery of texts left open on her phone. It was far quieter than that, and that's why it stuck. Quiet has a way of cutting deeper because there's no chaos to hide behind. It was a Thursday evening. I remember because Thursdays used to be our night. Early in our marriage, we'd promised each other that no matter how busy things got, Thursday nights were sacred. No work, no phones, just us. Sometimes it was dinner out. Sometimes it was a bottle of wine on the couch with a movie. Sometimes it was nothing but the comfort of knowing the world couldn't intrude for a few hours. And for years, I clung to those nights as proof that we were solid, that beneath the noise of her career and my long hours, we were still choosing each other. But that Thursday, I sat alone at our table, the candles burning low, staring at the untouched plates I had cooked because she'd promised she would be home by 7. I wasn't naive anymore. By then, I already suspected where she was. Still, I kept glancing at the clock, telling myself maybe she'd walk through the door with some rushed apology and I'd find the strength to believe it. By 8, the food was cold. By 9, my phone buzzed with a single text. Sorry, running late, don't wait up. I stared at those words until my vision blurred, not because I hadn't seen them before, but because I knew exactly what they meant. I had been dismissed, again, for him. She hadn't even bothered with an excuse anymore. She didn't have to. She knew I'd stopped fighting. So I put on my shoes, grabbed my jacket, and left. Not to chase her, not to catch them, but because I couldn't stand the suffocating silence of that apartment for one more second. I walked until my legs ached, circling the city like some ghost haunting his own life, and eventually, without meaning to, I found myself standing across the street from the bar where her office crew liked to unwind. And there she was, not inside, not with her colleagues, but outside, leaning against the brick wall, her head tilted back in laughter as he whispered something in her ear. I froze. My heart didn't hammer like I expected. Instead, it dropped into a slow, heavy thud. I watched as he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so intimate it made my stomach churn. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. She looked at him the way she used to look at me when we were still new, before routine dulled the edges of her smile. I must have stood there for 10 minutes, my body numb, my mind screaming. And then she turned, and for a split second, her eyes locked on mine across the street. The shock on her face was fleeting, quickly masked by annoyance, but it was enough. She knew she'd been caught, and worse, she didn't even look guilty. She looked inconvenienced, as if I were the problem for showing up, not her for being there. That look, God, that look, was my breaking point. Because in that instant, I realized she had been right about one thing. I wasn't paranoid. I was pathetic. Pathetic for waiting up, pathetic for cooking dinners that went cold, pathetic for believing her half-truths and rehearsed sighs. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was the obstacle she tolerated until she could get away clean. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't storm across the street or demand answers. I turned and walked away because I needed the anger to settle into something useful. Rage burns too fast. What I needed was fuel that would last long enough to outplay them both. The next morning, she breezed into the apartment like nothing had happened. I was at the table with a cup of coffee, pretending to scroll through my emails, when she kissed the top of my head and said, "Sorry about last night. Things just ran over." Her tone was so casual it was insulting. I looked up at her, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel doubt or confusion. I felt clarity. I remember saying, in a voice so calm it startled even me, "Do you know what the worst part is? It's not that you're lying. It's that you're so comfortable doing it." She froze, just for a moment. then smiled that practiced smile she used whenever she wanted to disarm me. "You're tired. Let's not start this again." But in my head, something had already started. The breaking point wasn't about catching her in the act. It wasn't even about him. It was about me finally realizing that I had been complicit in my own erasure. I had let her paint me as paranoid, let her gaslight me into silence, let her walk all over the life we built together while I stood by, afraid of losing her. And now, she was already gone, and I was left with nothing but the wreckage. Except I wasn't empty. Not anymore. Because as she poured her coffee and hummed to herself like we weren't crumbling, I made a promise in the quiet of my mind. I would not go down as the fool in their love story. They wanted me erased. They wanted a clean slate, a narrative where I was just the insecure husband who couldn't keep up. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they thought they could write me out of the story, I was going to make damn sure I wrote myself back in a way they would never forget. I did not rush into anything because the quickest moves are the loudest, and the loudest moves are the easiest to mistake for hysteria. I wanted something that would sit and rot under the world's tongue until people couldn't pretend the taste was sweet anymore. So I began with what any reasonable man with a sliver of tech savvy and a stubborn streak would do. I started keeping a record, and I treated that record like a lawyer treats a case file, with small, precise, almost boring discipline that would, in time, become undeniable. The first week after I decided I was done being the passive character in their play, I moved through the apartment like someone cataloging an estate rather than a home I had once shared, photographing receipts I had used to pay for dinners that had clearly been for three, copying calendar invites that showed team meeting at venues that only later appeared on wedding social accounts, saving screenshots of messages whose tone changed when I compared the public captions to the private words. And most important, I started mining the one reliable index the modern world leaves behind: metadata and timestamps. I learned quickly that a photograph on Instagram is not merely a pretty face. It is a breadcrumb trail if you have the patience and the right questions, because photographers and iPhones and wedding planners all leave little digital signatures that are easy to overlook when you are grieving or angry, but lethal when you want truth. I found the photographer's watermark on a cropped photo, and with a few careful emails written in a voice that suggested I was a professional insisting on a copy for family archives, I got the raw file. And in that raw file was a timestamp and a lens setting and the precise order in which the shots had been taken, which told me, among other things, that the first look sequence had been staged over multiple hours, and that several of those hours overlapped with nights she had told me she was working late. I did not reveal that I had the file to anyone yet, because the point was never to create spectacle. The point was to assemble a ledger that looked obvious even to people who wanted to look away. So I printed things out. I made a physical binder with tabs, texts, ride shares, receipts, photos, witness notes. And yes, it felt petty in a domestic sort of way to take the time to hole punch a stack of screenshots. But petty is a form of tenderness toward one's dignity when someone has been systematically erasing it. I visited the places where they had been photographed together, not to photograph them or to cause a scene, but to speak quietly to people who worked those nights. The bartender who remembered the exact hour she had asked for a private corner. The waitress who had noticed how often they ordered separate checks but left together. The event manager who admitted that the after-party was booked under a different name because it was cheaper that way. None of these things, on their own, proved infidelity or malice, but together they formed the kind of pattern that makes reasonable people tilt their heads and ask a modest but fatal question: why? I also reached out to a friend who had always been more practical than sentimental, a man named Marcus who had patched my ego after the divorce with blunt assessments and late-night beers. And when I pitched the idea of collecting testimony from people who had seen them together, Marcus didn't ask for details. He only asked what I needed and when I needed it. And then he showed up with a calm efficiency that made the whole thing feel less like vindictiveness and more like a project with a deadline. "You want receipts," he said over coffee in a voice that refused to be sentimental. "Then you make it hard for anyone to call you a liar. You want them to look small in front of people who matter to them, not in front of the internet. People who love them will find ways to forgive, but people who write their paychecks or sign their leases will not." He was right in a way that embarrassed me because it was cold and sensible. But revenge, I discovered, is less an art than applied pragmatism if you keep it honest. So Marcus began making discreet inquiries at her firm, asking about travel expenses and whether multiple overnight stays were typical for a particular client. Not because he wanted gossip, but because expense reports that do not match calendar invites produce uncomfortable conversations at HR meetings. He also found me two people who were willing to talk: an overworked junior who had once picked up her slack on a weekend, and a freelance consultant who remembered being asked to cover an evening that later appeared in wedding photos. Both accounts were small and messy and imperfect in ways that made them feel credible. People who conspire to lie usually polish their stories to a mirror sheen, not leave them with the jagged edges of human error. I am not proud of the way my mind moved toward these measures, but I am honest about the mechanics because that honesty is what made the plan feel fairer than the alternative of breaking windows or burning pictures, which would have been satisfying for a night and empty the next morning. I wanted them to keep their dignity in social media terms so that the retraction would have teeth in the quiet rooms where reputations are made and unmade. For instance, I drafted a letter, not a Facebook post, not a public takedown, but a letter addressed to three people I had chosen with surgical care: her parents, the head of her company's client services division, and one of the senior partners at the firm that had recently begun sponsoring their social circle. The letter was not sent blindly. It was a sealed envelope that I would only dispatch when the binder I had assembled was comprehensive and when the people who mattered most would be in a position to act on the information without it being reduced to melodrama. Every piece of evidence I collected would have a corresponding note: who I spoke to, when, what they said, and how it corroborated other items. I did this because I wanted the narrative to be invulnerable to their counter-narratives that would insist context matters, or you are being bitter. My goal was to make context inconvenient for them. There were nights when I worried that I was turning into someone else, a man who delighted in traps and timelines. But those worries were the same ones I had had when I wrote the first draft of a resignation letter at a job I loved, and then rewrote it because dignity demanded an exit strategy, not an exit spectacle. The plan required patience, and patience demanded that I sleep, shower, go to work, answer emails, and sit at poker nights pretending to care about a bad hand while I was actually thinking about timestamps and who would be the right person to receive a certain proof. I learned how to read camera angles and how to ask different questions in the right tone so bartenders didn't think I was hunting and HR managers didn't think I was making threats. And the more I learned, the more obvious their pattern became. Late nights that became early mornings, phone calls that turned into photo captions, small lies that turned into a story arc. One practical part of the plan that I will mention because it mattered more than I expected was the small economy of discretion I set up with Marcus and another friend named Eliza, who worked in a legal assistant role and who agreed to look at my binder not with legal eyes, but with skeptical ones. She told me, in a long, impatient paragraph that felt like kindness, that if I wanted people to take this seriously, I should index it, label things chronologically, and avoid overstatement in the narrative I might share. She helped me rewrite my notes so they read like careful observations rather than the breathless diary of a man wronged. Because the way you present anger determines whether the world hears you as credible or merely theatrical. Her edits were merciless but helpful, and when she finished, she slid the binder back to me and said, "This will land like a pebble in a pond if you throw it at the right time." That image lodged in my head because it spoke to the essence of what I was trying to do. Not to blow up their world in public spectacle, but to make small ripples in places where their choices would encounter consequences they could not like. There is a strange, almost clinical rhythm to gathering evidence for something deeply personal. It drained some of the heat from my anger and replaced it with a focus that felt almost professional. This shift made me efficient and less likely to act out of spite, because efficiency requires a clear objective and a timeline, and revenge without a timeline is just suffering. I kept reminding myself that the point was not to punish them for the sensation of being humiliated, but to restore the version of myself that refuses to be written out quietly. I would rather be accused of being petty than of being erased. The plan had become a ledger of small justice. A photocopy of a rideshare receipt next to a hotel invoice. An event booking with overlapping times next to a screenshot of a message excusing an absence. A photographer's EXIF data next to a waitress's note. Each item alone might mean little, But together they would make their story shrink in the rooms where it mattered, and that is precisely what I intended to do. I chose the rooms where truth mattered and where the paper I had made would do what social media could not. I did not want a circus. I wanted consequences that hurt where their choices counted. And so the first meeting was with the head of client services at her firm, a trim man named Donovan who ran the sort of operation where reputation translated directly into profit and where a whisper about impropriety could cost a team a client and cost a partner a bonus. And I remember sitting across from him in a glass office that smelled faintly of lemon polish while I placed the binder on his desk like a small, deliberate landing, watching the way his fingers paused when he lifted the first page, and how his eyes narrowed not in fury but in calculation, because businessmen notice patterns for reasons colder than emotion. "You should know I'm not here to humiliate anyone in public," I said, and the words came out measured because Eliza had been right about tone and structure, and because the room demanded calm rather than theatrics, and I watched him take in the receipts, the rideshare histories, the photographer's EXIF data, the calendar overlays printed in neat columns. And when he reached the page with the internal expense reports that didn't match the calendar invites, he set the binder down and exhaled in a way that sounded like a man who finally understood the shape of a risk. He asked questions I expected. Where did I get this? Who else knows? And I answered them plainly, offering names and timelines and witness notes. And he listened without the smugness I had imagined he'd bring, which made the whole confrontation more dangerous because it felt like a boardroom verdict forming behind his eyes. He promised to look into it quietly and said, in a voice that was not unkind, that the firm had policies about conflicts of interest and about personal conduct that could result in internal reviews and, if the evidence warranted it, formal reprimands. And when he said that he did not mention my ex-wife's name with scorn, but with the kind of institutional language that implied consequences in meetings where bonuses were decided, I felt a small, predatory satisfaction because the ledger was doing its work. From there, I moved to her parents because I knew that for all the polished photos and RSVP lists, there were people who still mattered to her whose opinions could, if shifted, create a pressure she could not ignore. And I remember the drive to their house like a slow, determined meditation where every traffic light felt like a rehearsal of patience. And when I sat across from them in their tidy living room, I did not begin with accusation, but with evidence laid out like a neutral object that needed interpretation. And their faces changed the way faces change when a child brings home a school report that is both confusing and devastating. Confusion first, then concern, then the faint heat of a parent's protective pride folding into shame. "We raised her to be better than this," her father said at one point, his voice low and not cruel but tired, and I listened as they asked me questions about dates and about whether I had confronted her directly, and I told them the truth about my attempts at explanation and the way she had deflected and how I had been advised not to react publicly because it would make me appear bitter rather than wronged, and their eyes filled with that particular kind of sorrow that is equal parts empathy, and the dawning recognition that their child had made a different choice than the one they would have wanted. They did not promise consequences, and they did not offer me comfort in any generous way, but they asked to keep the binder until they had time to look at it properly before bringing it to the family lawyer. And that conservatism suited me because I wanted the pressure to build in quiet places, not explode like a headline that could be ignored. The third envelope I sent the same week went to the senior partner of a company that had begun sponsoring the social circle that had hosted many of the events where the photos were taken, and I addressed that letter with the same calm specificity I had used with Donovan. I included a cover note that summarized the evidence and asked for an internal review of any conflicts of interest the partner might deem relevant. And I remember the week after sending that letter receiving a terse email from the partner's office acknowledging receipt and promising to forward the matter to their compliance team, which is not drama, but it is leverage, and leverage is what I wanted. Slow, insistent, bureaucratic pressure that would not be erased by a curated apology or a staged photo. In the meantime, I made sure my own actions were discreet. Marcus and Eliza continued to collect witness notes and to act as quiet conduits, and I watched from the outside as their world, my ex-wife's carefully arranged world, began to encounter resistance in places where reputations are fragile and money is decisive. The first real crack came at the firm's quarterly review when Donovan called a private meeting with her and two other managers to discuss expense reports and overlap in client visits. And I know because Marcus texted me a single line that said, "They stepped into it," while I sat in a bar pretending to watch a game on TV and actually listening to my own breath. And the way things unfolded after that felt almost merciless in its ordinariness. An internal inquiry, a request that she provide, documentation for certain stays, and the slow, humiliating administrative process that strips narrative from people by reducing their lives to forms and invoices and emails. She was placed on administrative leave pending review, which meant she lost access to certain accounts, and had her calendar scrutinized in ways that are numbing to the person on the other side, because it is like being asked to prove that you deserve the life you have been living. And in that quiet bureaucracy, I felt a vindication that was not about joy, but about the restoration of something I had been denied. Recognition that my observations were not fantasies, but evidence. Then came the hardest conversation, the one I had rehearsed in my head 100 times, but never wanted to enact because I knew it would make me ugly in ways I did not control. I asked to see her, not in public and not to humiliate her, but to hand her the binder and let her look at it and make whatever explanations she wanted to offer in the presence of a witness. And when she arrived at the small cafe we used to frequent, she looked composed in a way that suggested she expected me to beg or to rage, and instead I set the binder between us and said, in a voice that refused to climb to the melodramatic, "Look." She opened the binder slowly, and when her fingers found the photographed timestamps and the receipts and the taxi logs, she did not look surprised. She looked premeditated, as if she had long been ready to organize facts in her head in a way that justified her choices. "I thought you'd have the decency not to bring this to people," she said finally, not a question but a reproach, and I told her plainly that decency had been the one thing she had traded for convenience, and that I was not interested in seeing her dressed and fortified for the world while the truth sat in my hands. She responded with a long speech about how careers are complicated and how sometimes two adults who understand each other find comfort where their work intersects. And she painted herself as a pragmatic woman who had been honest in the only way she knew how. And when I asked about the speed between the divorce and the wedding, she said, with a softness that was almost bored, that love does not keep schedules and that we had both moved on. And the simplicity of that line made my guts clench, because it was the same sentence she had used to quiet me months before. There was a point in that conversation when she leaned in and asked me, with an explanation dressed as concern, whether I understood how scandal works and how public scenes would only hurt everyone involved. And I replied in what I hoped was a clear voice that the point of my actions was not to make a viral spectacle, but to ensure that the choices she had made had repercussions in places beyond Instagram, because consequences, unlike likes, have a longer half-life. And I remember her looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance and saying, "You always make things more difficult than they have to be." And it was true in a way that stung because I had invested so much energy in being reasonable that my very reasonableness had been used against me. I handed her the binder and told her Marcus and Eliza had corroboration for everything if she wanted to dispute particulars, and she closed it with a slow, deliberate motion and said nothing more than, "You'll regret this," which read less like a threat and more like a promise she made herself to preserve some story in which she was not the villain. Regret, however, is a strange currency. It does not often buy what we expect. The week after the meeting, HR requested additional documentation, and because her firm was cautious about its client relationships, a sponsor pulled back from an event that had been slated to feature her team. And because compliance wanted to avoid liability, they began to reassign certain accounts, which in turn meant a visible change in her career trajectory, and invitations reseated in the social circle as if someone had quietly informed the hosts that discretion was advisable. The wedding, which had been announced with that crisp press-ready photo, started to seem like a set piece that might be reopened, and people began to ask questions in private. Not the clanging public questions of angry commenters, but the smaller, more consequential queries of people who sign checks and write checks. And those questions are the ones that can make a life inconvenient in the way that matters. The final break came not with a shout, but with the slow peeling of consequences. The partner who had been set to sponsor an event rescinded the sponsorship. Her firm offered her a settlement to avoid public legal exposure if she agreed to step down from certain roles. Her parents, after a week of private review, decided they wanted to handle things within the family for now. and the man she had married, the one I had once been told was just a friend, began to look less like a prize and more like someone who had assisted in a complicated extraction, which is not a crime, but it is a social cost that accumulates. I did not celebrate with champagne. I felt a complex quiet in which the ledger had done its work and people were now encountering choices that had costs attached, and the sound of those small, administrative consequences felt louder than any shout because they registered where it mattered most. In bank accounts, in job responsibilities, in the curated calendars of people who keep their lives tidy. The strange thing about revenge is that the aftermath never looks like the movie version. There's no triumphant music, no sudden explosion of applause, no cinematic close-up of the villain's face crumbling while the hero walks away. What you get instead is silence. Heavy, stretching silence that settles into your bones and makes you realize you've changed the shape of something forever, even if no one is clapping for you. The silence came for me the morning I opened my email and saw a short message from Marcus. It's done. She's out. No explanation, no dramatic detail. Just confirmation that the firm had finally taken action after weeks of review. She had been given the option to resign quietly instead of enduring a drawn-out internal inquiry, and she'd taken it. It wasn't in the papers, it wasn't whispered through town, but it was enough. The career she paraded in front of everyone as proof of her brilliance now had a scar on its record, and no amount of curated Instagram posts could airbrush that away. I learned through back channels that the sponsorship deal collapsed entirely. The senior partner I had written to chose to redirect the money into another team, one far removed from her orbit. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't humiliating in a headline sense, but in the world she had built, one fueled by appearances, advancement, and connections, it was devastating. Invitations dried up. Clients asked cautious questions. Colleagues distanced themselves. Slowly but surely, the social circle she had used to prop up her story began shrinking, and the cracks that had once been invisible widened into gaps she couldn't cover with smiling photos. The personal consequences were quieter, but sharper. Her parents, who had been so proud of the wedding, pulled back. They didn't disown her, but I knew from a mutual acquaintance that dinners turned tense, conversations clipped, the air thick with unspoken disappointment. The fairy tale marriage she'd imagined as her clean slate was already wobbling. I heard whispers, careless remarks from people who thought I'd moved on, that her new husband was feeling the weight of everything too. It's one thing to steal someone else's partner under the sheen of secrecy. It's another to wake up every day beside them in the full glare of the fallout. They were no longer a story of romance and destiny. They were a story of suspicion and scandal. As for me, I didn't feel the rush I thought I would. There was no burst of laughter, no fist-pump moment where I declared victory. What I felt was release. The constant gnawing question, was I crazy? Was I paranoid? Was I the fool? Finally had an answer. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I had been right all along. And by methodically showing the truth, I had forced the world to acknowledge it too. That acknowledgement, even in silence, was worth more than any spectacle. The reflection part is harder, because revenge doesn't give you back the years you lost or the nights you spent doubting yourself. It doesn't rebuild trust or erase the memory of her leaning against a brick wall, laughing at something whispered by the man she'd claimed was just a friend. It doesn't make you feel whole again, but it does give you something else, something that, in its own way, is just as important. It gives you back yourself. For months, I had let her dictate the narrative of who I was. The insecure husband, the overthinker, the man who couldn't trust. Now, that narrative was gone. I had replaced it with one built on truth. People saw her for who she was, not who she pretended to be. And me? I wasn't the bitter ex shouting into the void. I was the man who chose patience over spectacle, evidence over accusation, precision over noise. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far. If showing her parents, her firm, her sponsors was excessive. But then I remember sitting alone at that table on a Thursday night, the candles burning down, the food going cold, the text arriving with a casual, "Don't wait up." I remember the look on her face when she caught my eyes across the street with him, not guilty, but annoyed. And I remember the laughter, the rehearsed tenderness, the captions about destiny. No, I don't think I went too far. I think I went exactly far enough. What remains is not joy, but a quiet pride. Pride that I didn't explode in a way that would have made me look unstable. Pride that I refused to let them erase me. Pride that, in the end, I kept control of the one thing they couldn't steal, my dignity. Revenge didn't give me back my marriage. It didn't erase the betrayal. But it did leave me with the one thing that betrayal had taken from me. The certainty that I could see the truth, trust myself, and act on it. And in the end, that certainty was the most satisfying consequence of all.